Welcome, PGCPS Family. Welcome if this is your first time here. Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in again. If you are a returning PGCPS Wellness family member, we are so glad to have you here. My name is Roddia Paul, and you are tuned into this week's Rich in Wellness. We are continuing our series on productivity, right? Productivity is important because this whole entire workshop that we do on a series basis is all about our ability to feel well, to be well, to understand what wellness looks like and feels like for us. And all of that really stems down to us understanding our own individual definitions of what these things are, right? So we already talked about what self-care looks like on an individual level. We talked about what it means to be mindful on an individual level. And now we want to use this series to talk about what it means to be productive on an individual level, and individually what things may be impacting our ability to feel well and to feel productive, right? So in doing so, we will be examining over the next course of the next 3 weeks different things that may or may not contribute to our ability to be productive, right? So take all of these things and understand that they may not be true for you, right? Or they may feel like they resonate with you, but if they don't, we challenge you each week to figure out for yourself what these things mean for you. If they don't mean anything for you, figure out for yourself, okay, maybe it's not anxiety, maybe it's not, stress, maybe it's not lack of intrinsic motivation, maybe it's not perfectionism, right? But what is it? And unpack that for yourself. And all of those are important things to understand, because whether or not we realize it, they're all about being well, right? Our ability to feel well is impacted by those various experiences. So one thing that we're going to focus on today, with all that being said, is perfectionism, right? So perfectionism, for me, as my own personal definition, I feel perfectionism for me is when I'm being overly self-critical of myself based on unrealistic or unobtainable goals or expectations of myself. And those type of things often stem from us internalizing, us feeling inside, or us receiving messages from other people, that we're less than if we are not perfect, that, we're incapable if we cannot do it without a flaw, right? So that's my own personal definition. Think about if that feels true for you as well. And if it doesn't, I challenge you to define what perfectionism is to you and when or why you feel like you're experiencing it. Those are all crucial to the rest of the things that we're going to talk about today, right? So one of them being, is perfectionism self-serving, right? Can it be a good thing? It can in some ways, right? So perfectionism can be an intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is just motivation that we find within ourselves. We find something within ourselves that helps us complete what we need to complete. And perfectionism for many people can be a driving force in finding motivation within ourselves. Our need to do things correctly is what helps empower us to follow them through. But in that same breath, perfectionism can hinder us, because too much of anything is not a good thing, right? So perfectionism can become a cycle that hinders your ability to be well, to feel well, right? What does that look like? When is perfectionism hindering us? Well, usually perfectionism can maybe look like you're feeling anxiety, and that anxiety turns into procrastination or avoidance. And as a result, that turns into low productivity. So that's how it may look, right? So perfectionism can lead to anxiety, which can lead to procrastination, which can lead to avoidance, which is a form of procrastination. And then all of those three things in accordance together is what causes us to have low productivity. But why does that happen? What causes perfectionism? What causes anxiety? What causes us to procrastinate? What are the connections there? So the first thing is really about wellness, and that's why we are talking about productivity during our wellness workshops, because usually perfectionism is embedded in our own experiences, in our own perception of self, or in the version of ourself we feel like people paint of us, right? So those two together, or sometimes separately, can cause us to create unrealistic goals of ourself, right? And because those goals are so unrealistic, we then sometimes may experience a fear of failing. We may experience low confidence. We may experience low self-esteem. We may either never want to start something or never want to finish, may start a whole bunch of things but never finish, because these goals are so unrealistic that we don't have the confidence to try and achieve them, to try and continue them, to try and be productive through them, because they were never something that we could have achieved in the first place. You know what I mean? And that's what's unrealistic about them, right? And so it's like we have to try and ask ourselves questions, because really what it boils down to, especially right now, with COVID and virtual learning and virtual school and a lot of us working from home, there's a lot of things we can't really control, right? And so I think it's important for us to reclaim and think about the things that we can control and how that can help heighten us feeling productive in a season where many of us are battling feeling unmotivated because we're stuck in the house, right? So what does this look like? I think there's 3 important questions to ask yourself, right? When thinking about if perfectionism is something that you're dealing with, if you do deal with it, these are important things to ask yourself. So one being, how do you define your self-worth? That's an important question, because oftentimes our perfectionism stems from us feeling like whether or not we are productive, whether or not we feel like we're being successful, whether or not we feel like we're making a difference, like we're growing, defines who we are as an individual, right? And oftentimes that's not true, but we just place a definition of ourselves based on our ability to produce outcomes to other people, right? So it's important to separate yourself from the task, right? So you still have self-worth whether or not you've completed this unrealistic goal you've set for yourself. So the first challenge is define your self-worth outside of task, outside of goals, outside of feeling productive. How do you define your self-worth as an individual? The next question is, how do you empower yourself? And that's really important, right? Because really what it stems down to when it comes to being productive, when it comes to our perfectionism interfering with being productive, is we often give up our power. We give up our power to that thing. And that's where that low self-esteem, that feeling unintrinsically motivated, that, having low self-confidence, that fear of failing, all that stems from us giving up our power to something that we can't control. Then the last question I want you to ask yourself is, what are your strengths? That is extremely important when dealing with perfectionism and productivity. Because when you know your strengths, you can use your strengths to complete your task in a more obtainable way. Be realistic with yourself. When we are unrealistic with ourselves, we set ourselves up to feel fear, to feel low confidence, to feel low self-esteem. We set ourselves up for that fear when we're not realistic with ourselves. So those are 3 important questions. And I'm going to repeat them one more time. How do you define your self-worth? How do you empower yourself? And what are your strengths? And then the homework for this week is for you to examine those questions for yourself, right? Examine those questions for yourself. Answer those questions for yourself, because they're going to be really important for you when you're in the moment, right? Because a lot of times we noticed when we may be being unrealistic about our goals. We may be being unrealistic about a task. We may be being unrealistic about ourselves in certain situations, right? So it's important to be able to examine the situation, examine your perspective of the situation, and if your perspective does not serve you, then challenge yourself to create an alternative perception. So for example, if I'm completing a very, very, time-consuming, difficult, hard task for work. And I am setting unrealistic goals of how much of it I need to complete and when, and how much of it I need to know and be well versed in, even if I've never done this before. I've never done this project before. I've never attacked this before. I set a goal for myself that I have to be able to do it on my own. I have to do it this good, this fast, and by this date. And that is really, really, really unrealistic. You're doing something you've never done before. You're not going to be expected to have all the answers. You're not going to be expected to do everything, super, super fast, way ahead of the deadline. It's okay, to ask for help. It's okay to say, I've never done this before. Let me maybe ask a coworker. Let me ask my supervisor, get more clarification. That is creating an alternative perspective, right? And helping yourself to be productive. Because if we stay within these perspectives that are unrealistic, it really does hinder our ability to be productive, because it creates fear. And it also creates us feel like we're never completing, like we're never achieving, because we're stuck in that cycle. And I think that that's something that's really important to understand when it comes to productivity, right? Is our perspective of the task that we're doing and our perspective of our capabilities to do the task, right? Really being realistic with yourself and present with what you're experiencing, how you feel. All those things come back full circle. The self-care stuff we've been talking about, the mindfulness stuff we've been talking about, it all comes full circle when it comes to our productivity, right? How well we feel about ourselves, about our task, about how we are presently in that moment really will impact how productive we feel. And it really is coinciding with our first workshop in this series on what productivity is, right? Defining that for yourself first, defining who you are as a person, unattached from that, and then using both of those to check yourself in a moment where you may be causing your own self to be less productive, right? Because you're not being kind to yourself. You're not being compassionate to yourself. You're not being realistic with yourself. So all of those things are just some food for thought for this week, and challenging you to do that activity, to answer those 3 questions, to sit with yourself and to really try and unpack what these things may mean for you. And then we're going to check back next week, and we're going to talk about some more things that may be impacting and what activities that you can do to explore that for yourself, starting with stress and depression, and then we'll be ending with intrinsic motivation. So as always, thank you so much for sitting in with me today, for talking and chatting with me today, and we will see you same time, same place next week.